Thanks, Jose. That was an amazing introduction. Makes me sound really good. Um, it sounds very like my career was very intentional and intellectual. But I guess the truth is that it was more intuitive, and I felt my way through and thought about it afterwards. So I was following compulsions within myself. I guess in the Anglo sort of intellectual tradition that we find ourselves in, white people tend to abstract things out from feelings and what gave them meaning. So I'm, but I'm Maori. So in my culture, we don't do that. For example, our carvings are very beautiful, but not just for the sake of looking good. They embed our stories and our navigational sciences that helped us to sail the Pacific hundreds of years before Captain Cook did. Nietzsche, he used to make ad hominem arguments, which are considered logical fallacies in philosophy, but I kind of get him. Ad hominem, I guess, is a fancy way of saying everything is personal, even theory. And my personal story is I'm trained in philosophy, so ideas are my stock and trade, and mainly philosophical ideas, and also ideas in the world of psychoanalysis and so on. And when it comes to talking about kind of ideas and how ideas have progressed throughout history, I spend quite a lot of my professional time involved in that. But when it came to the question of spirituality, I wondered if there is such a thing in spirituality as the soul. But I really wonder what use ideas would be to it. Ideas seem to me to be a particularly cognitive, obviously ideational set of phenomena, like thoughts, and these wouldn't necessarily help us to grow or develop or mature our souls in any way. And I suppose that was kind of the first juncture at which I began to feel certain limitations in the notions of ideas. And I think the thought behind that was, well, ideas almost by definition aren't real because they take place in our heads, and they are by their nature somewhat detached from reality, and they have the quality of speculation, and they tend to be more about the future or speculative in that sense, or they're about possibilities that may have happened from the past. So to that extent, ideas and reality, they aren't really connected. And I would think it would be the case that if there is such a thing as the soul, it will be much more interested in the real. So I guess that this was the first thought, that ideas are somehow not connected to reality. And if I wanted to be particularly provocative about it, I'd say in that respect that ideas are actually cousins of the lie, because they're not grounded in the real, and they're somehow sort of fictional or detached from what's real. So when we're talking about an idea, we're not reporting on fact. We're reporting on something whose relationship to fact is somewhat tenuous. So my first experience of this was my dad's sudden death. My father, he overdosed in my last semester of uni in 2016, possibly on purpose. He wasn't happy when he died, and I made a pact with myself to do only exactly what I wanted to be doing all of the time. It made me realize the lies I was telling myself to be safe, when really I wanted different things in life, and I was too in my head to pay attention to my heart. So death has a way of revealing the truths of the heart. And I was doing psychology and living in Brisbane, but I actually loved music and theory, and at the time much preferred to not be living in Brisbane. And I think these things are, these are things my artistic and Indigenous friends saw in me before I did. So people like Alice Ether and Hannah Bronte and Uda, Tim Welsh, Indiri, Andy, Nicola, Nadia Hernandez, Amrita Happy, and Daniel Yenach. Well, I list all of these friends because I think the friends are very important in life and very related to this theory, because they see through your mind's self-deceptions and into your deeper self, or maybe your soul. But this set of thoughts, I think, connected with another set of practices, I guess, that I've been involved in, because alongside my writing work and my thinking work and so on, I'm involved in, I guess, a broadly psychotherapeutic practice that some of you may have heard of, called clubbing. Yeah. So the idea is you're joyously exposing hidden or unconscious dynamics within bodies and groups and even cultural systems and sexuality and gender and so on. And that work can't function unless we actually turn our ideas off, which is something helped by incredibly loud music and drinking and lights, and they force you to have distance from your thoughts because ideas, they just get in the way. The trouble with ideas is that they obscure our relationship to reality or the present sometimes. And by obscuring our relationship to reality, they inhibit our grasp of what's before us. So let me give you a couple of illustrations of this by way of talking about it. So I started a party called Precog, and I wrote a text to go with it called Club Theory that I wrote with the writer Sally Olds. So pre and cog, or cognition, that which comes before thought. And I curated with this in mind, and our first event definitely looked at this, and our second 24-hour rave that we did looked at the soul's search for the transcendent. So that is, why do people want to stay out for so long? What are they looking for? They want to keep the party going, have kick-ons. It seemed to me like maybe they were looking for an amazing kind of out-of-world, out-of-body experience that changes them forever, something transcendent. Yeah, so first of all, there's different ways of seeing. So it seems to me that there are four ways of seeing the world. And the most dominant one is an ideas-based way of seeing the world. So my nickname for it is Google Glasses. So you have, well, they were really ugly and I don't think they really took off. But you have glasses, and up on the kind of screen in front of you come lots of bytes of information, and you can use them to decode the world around you. So it provides like a filter. So it's a little bit like going to visit monuments around the world, and you'll often see tourists, and they're looking at the monument primarily through the iPhone lens or through the camera lens, and rather than looking at the object itself. So there's a kind of mediated environment through which we're looking at the world through a lens, and rather than looking at the world directly. I say this is ideas-based because what we then look at the world with is an idea of it, rather than just the reality. So I'll give you an example of this in relationships, or particularly couple relationships, or I know many queers will relate, share house relationships. What tends to go wrong is like when each partner or person has an idea of the other person, rather than being able to see the reality of the other person, and that becomes intolerable. For example, if my partner has the idea that I'm crazy, as men sometimes do if you are a black or brown woman, although it may be that some of the time I act irrationally, as we all do, sometimes the fact that he holds that as an idea of me all of the time becomes intolerable, and therefore he sees every action that I do through the lens of that craziness, and rather than giving me a break sometimes because I'm stressed out about having to juggle 10 projects and look after my sister, for example. So say you have a project as well, and you come to think of the person that you're working with as a bit of a slacker, and so one day they turn up late to a meeting again, and you think, yeah, well, of course they're late because they're a bit of a slacker, and I've got this idea about this person, and my idea of them has been confirmed through the behavior that I've seen. But what actually happened maybe is that this person has been helping a cyclist that's been knocked over on the street outside the cafe, but I don't see that. It's out of view because what I'm seeing is my idea of this person being a bit of a slacker. And that idea is kind of a filter through which I see them, and it limits my grasp of the reality of what's going on. So we tend to see the world through our idea of it rather than through what it just is. And that's one way, I guess, in which ideas are the most perhaps common way of seeing, at least, and ideas get in the way of our ability to experience what could be called a phenomenological world. So when we have our Google glasses on, and when we see the world, most of the time we're working hermeneutically. So that is, we're working interpretively. We're trying to interpret the world around us, and because there's so much to see and experience, that reduces the world into something more manageable. as opposed to working phenomenologically when we're not reducing the world to ideas and thoughts, we're just experiencing it. And because it's much harder for us as human beings, generally speaking, simply to experience the world than to interpret it. Because interpretation provides a smaller little package. It bundles up the world into little bites that we can cope with and digest. But I think that's a loss. And if I talk about it, other ways of seeing, I think we can see some of the benefits that come once we can wean ourselves off this filtered, mediated, idea-based way of looking at the world. And so there's a kind of Google Glasses way of seeing the world, which I think is common, and I think we all do it all of the time. So the second one is what could be called a much more pure way of seeing the world, and it's a kind of data view or data view. So there are no interpretations whatsoever. There's a famous tool in the world of organizational psychology. So I was doing some org psych research many moons ago, and it's called the ladder of inference. So what it says is we all need to use much less interpretation of what goes on around us and just stick to the facts. So let's just report what we see in front of us rather than trying to sort of add anything to it. So I'm always struck when thinking about this by an anecdote from James Joyce when he taught writing classes in Italy where he was living at the time, and instead of asking his students to produce florid poetry or beautiful literary descriptions of the world, or tell or embellish stories, he simply asked them to note down what was in the room, so desk, tables, glasses of water, ceiling fittings, and of course, it turns out that was very hard for people to do, because our instinct is always to add more than what is necessary. The effort of seeing can be very hard effort altogether, and yet, of course, it's really the basis of good noticing. And it's to that extent, good fact is really the origin of excellent fiction. So I just took on a reading challenge this week to read for 30 minutes every day. I don't think anyone's read a book since 2012. Anyway, so good fiction seems to me to be a real clarity of view, but one that you can only begin to get to once we lose some of our idea clutter. And I think it's at that second level in which we begin to move beyond ideas and experience the world a little more what we call phenomenologically or inclusively. And it's a state of mind that we induce at the club, particularly an inclusive queer club with many minorities present, and ideally so we sort of accept everything that's before us. There'll be people tapping into their unconscious and regressing with sort of childlike behavior, and we take them on board without preconceived notions or judgment. And this is also a more indigenous way of seeing, and it's not a Cartesian sort of thinking thing that's separate from a material world where it's just you and your thoughts and the world out there, somewhere out there. And no, actually you're embedded in the world, and things are much more immediate and fluid. So in my culture, Māori, we believe that the rivers are our circulation, the trees are our lungs, and everything is sort of interconnected, and it's just there, and we aren't mediating it as separate from the world. And that's why for Precog we did a Māori and Pacifica event at Firstdraft last year. So I guess this also leads on to why I started Ngāti Kangaru. So I think there are two other ways of seeing this, which are rarer, but I think equally useful and helpful to us as human beings if we want to kind of make the most of the gift of being alive. So, and all the faculties we have. So the third mode of seeing is I use the word hazing. So like when you kind of things go hazy and slightly out of focus. So I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I think it happens from time to time when you're in a conversation or you're at a party or a club night like Ngāti Kangaru or Precog. You begin to understand the whole a little bit better, precisely because you lose focus on it. Like the contours blur things, become a little softer, and your understanding sort of increases. and increases precisely because you're not seeing so much sharpness of detail. And what emerges is a kind of more impressionistic picture that allows you to feel what's going on, and you're shifting from an idea space to a more even physical and embodied space, like in a club, and it's more chromatic and deeply intuitive, that kind of space. And it includes more of the ambient environment in which you're working or dancing, and it doesn't turn it over into a kind of sharp fact that that you can produce ideas around. It's a little bit like seeing things in hindsight as well. Sometimes you'll have been in a difficult conversation, it might have been confusing or awkward for you, and only later you suddenly understand what was going on, and it's that sense of now you get it, and not because you understand any particular detail, but you have an awareness that wasn't accessible to you when you were seeing things from in it, or from other modes, if you like. And again, what's important about this level of seeing is, I think that it takes us away from an idea space, and just here, and maybe into something a bit more holistic and inclusive. So I started Ngāti Kangaru, for example, because when I'm with Māori, there's an ambient feeling of continuity between each other and our souls, and that's hard to describe in words. But I know that we all feel it as Māori, and for instance, we all see ourselves in Taika Waititi. I mean, he is all of us, and we are all Taika. Over my life, I had this gradual realization of my Māoriness, looking at past behavior and interactions with other Māori in hindsight. So my love of music came from my culture before we left New Zealand, and my rejection of my culture when I was a child, it came from my Māori mother having bipolar, and as a child I was very traumatized by that, and I made that negative association, and I assimilated for survival, really, living in racist rural Queensland as a teenager. And these were false ideas or thoughts that, it was a future-oriented brain, the idea-based brain sort of designing these thoughts to protect me. And when I look back, no particular fact had changed, but my understanding of my life had changed in hindsight. And so Ngāti Kangaru, we look at Māori in Australia. So for instance, New Zealanders, they get no benefits from the Australian government, yet they're a large contributor to the Australian economy. But Australians get benefits in New Zealand. There's that very unilateral thing, whereas it used to be more balanced and going both ways. We are disconnected from our culture and yet sort of painfully close geographically. We also have no unity. So there is no Māori in Australia organisation. There's a lack of Māori spokespeople in Australia, which became particularly evident after the Christchurch tragedy, outside of which I only really saw the occasional haka. And that seemed wrong to me. And New Zealanders are also the number one nationality in Australian immigration detention, and not a lot of people know that. And of course, it's disproportionately Māori and Pacifica. And that was something that was highlighted by Jacinta Ardern on a recent visit here. So Ngāti Kangaru is a kind of artistic club night or performance, and the Māori Australian members are Tyson Campbell, Bella Waru, Jamaica Moana, Sean Miles, and I. We're the central members, and we are supported a lot by other people who are interested as well in what it takes. We want to take a look at sort of what it meant to be a modern Māori in Australia, and in all of our sort of iterations, in all of our queerness or transness, and what that meant sort of cross-culturally as well, because we have different categories for things, or actually less categories. We're sort of more open and expansive about those kinds of things, but that's something that we needed to connect with as well. And we're helped and supported by our Miss Blanks, David Murphy, our friend Pipiana, and Connor from Fortunes. So again, wouldn't be anywhere without our friends. And a fourth way of seeing I'll just touch on before giving a very different example is what I would call a very meta way of seeing. And so we'll be in a situation where, as it were, we rise above the chessboard. So I also started playing chess recently. Lockdown things. So we see ourselves as one of the players on the chessboard itself. And it's a bit like, most of our lives, we're just on the chessboard effectively, and our view is obscured, and it's a bit like being at a gig, but you can't see the band because of other people's heads. And occasionally, we do get the opportunity sometimes, but it happens completely by chance, and I think it's probably quite rare. So we see ourselves as part of the scene in which we're taking part, and at that level, we're not seeing ideas at all. What we're appreciating is not only the whole, but our place in the whole. And this equips us to sort of understand the world again in a more rounder, sort of more broadly than we normally can. And it spares us from the anxiety of producing ideas about the world or interpreting the world. So, an example from my own life, I'm retired now. I'm a retired DJ, semi-retired, but still doing some things in the art world. But, in July last year, I played in Paris at the Palais de Tokyo for Justin Scholder and Corinne. And I realized as an ethnic DJ / art type person, I'd kind of peaked. And I kind of had this bird's eye view of everything. And I saw that nothing is really new. And that I have this theory, there's only structures of power, and everybody fills a place card. It's my place card theory. So, everyone occupies a place card, and someone new just comes in to fill the place card, and you go up or you go out. And I knew someone would replace my old position, and the cycle would just continue ad infinitum. And I think I already know which people they are, actually. Anyway, and so the specific content or the types of music may change, and the fashion may change, but the rhetoric really stays more or less the same, and the place cards stay in the same place, and even the emotions or the journey of the new person in my old place card goes on. It's the same, and it reflects your own development. I mean, I watch them from Instagram, and I'm like, wow, I can see where you're going, and I was there once too. And sort of equally, the same types of white people remain in power largely. So I decided to tap out of that cycle. I know this seems quite defeatist or cynical, but it doesn't mean everyone's journey is meaningless. It just means that I could see how the whole worked and how all the pieces on the chessboard kind of fit together, and maybe it wasn't a type of game I felt like playing anymore. I do think at the same time, things are changing. Change is occurring very slowly, like a glacial pace, but that's still heartening to see. I wanted to make a few points about creativity as well. This move away from ideas, it began with me, first of all, in this personal project around spirituality after my father's passing, and having a more post-colonial view of my mother's mental issues. And then this began to connect up with the work I was doing anyway in clubbing and other forms of indigenous kind of non-cognitive, non-ideational inquiry. And I've come to see it mapped out, particularly in ordinary experiences of seeing and how different they are. So if you see how you see, if you notice how you notice the world and the different qualities to it, you can understand how ideas aren't always the way in which you do see the world or have to see the world, and that the idea-based approach of seeing the world, this hermeneutic, interpretive way, though helpful in terms of making sense of what's going on, it's also somewhat limiting. And I just want to add another example or two just to try and illustrate what is, after all, a rather abstract subject, and we know that I want to avoid being abstract, by talking about a couple of examples of working with creativity. I mean, I'm a DJ and a writer, but I also work a lot with, and I'm friends with artists and dancers and so on, and people in the creative world, and I want to try and I want to help them, and I help them with their creativity, and when they get blocked, and so on. And so, artists and organizations from all different media, especially, conceptual artists and think tank type groups, they'll come and, they say, I've run out of ideas, or I'm having trouble with this idea. And it's as if they believe this idea is the thing that can unlock the world for them. But in my experience of working with them, whether as a friend or curator, it's actually not the idea that is the answer. It's often the idea that is the problem, because they have an idea of an idea. So they have an idea that their idea is going to come and rescue them. So there's going to be a big thing, like if I have a big idea, or they think I have a big idea and everything would follow. So I guess like the absence of a big idea, or the strain to find one, or create connections that don't really exist, seems to create a lot of tension and a lot of weak kind of art, and we lose energy, and you lose enthusiasm, and so there's often this sense that the big idea is the big answer. But in the world of creativity, it seems to me that it's not an idea that matters, but because ideas tend to operate, as I say, in a kind of figment, speculative frame in the mind, and has lost some contact with physical reality. And what seems to work better in the creative space is when people identify what I call their intuition, or their soul, or there's another term people use called the soulless, S-O-L-U-S. So it's soulless because, not soulless, it's soul-us, because it suggests what's solitary and what's unique. Because what matters about tapping into our creativity in this move away from ideas is that we move away from other people. There's something separating about it. We have to follow a path that is not that of anybody else. And we mustn't allow our fate to become entangled with that of others. And it's particularly common in artists because they've become very influenced by influences and previous masters in different media. So it's hard for them to break out of that influence and establish their own voice. They suffer from what Harold Bloom, a literary critic, called the anxiety of influence. And it's almost literally like an influenza. So you get a cold from the past or from Instagram, and you can't shake off the influence of people who've influenced you. And it's very important, it seems to me, that you get rid of that idea of the previous person or the influencer who's influenced you, partly because it's limiting and it stops you being yourself, and partly because it's an idea. You have an idea, a kind of fantasy essentially of what the previous person or that other person did, that you ought to be copying or following in some way. And yet, what's most hopeful or helpful for people in creative spaces, it seems to me, is when they wean themselves off that idea altogether and recognize how solitary the path of creativity has to be, and how non-ideas based it has to be. If they're going to locate what I call their intuition or their soul or the soulless, which I'll describe as it's like a principle of creative energy. We all have it within us, but we have it within us and get distracted from it because we go looking for an idea rather than its sources in ourselves or its source in ourselves. So the soulless is most clearly recognized when we think about those things which return to us again and again. So there's things, that bug us, or things that come up in our dreams, the images that we can't shake, and the repeated phrases, pictures, and sounds, and things that crop up again and again in our thinking. And when we go back and you log the kind of deeper stuff that's coming from our unconscious without us being able to filter it, we're able to start to get at what I call your intuition or your creative energy or your soulless. And it's a kind of creative principle within all of us. But we have to allow ourselves to become as peculiar as we all are. And this peculiarity lies in the uniqueness of our dreams, our history, the attraction or appeal we have for certain images or people or words that are very odd to us and to others, and so we might even feel a little bit ashamed of ourselves or our relationship to them, and but it's defining of us in some way, and it's only by giving ourselves over to that particular idiom that we begin to find our soul. And this is also why clubs can be the most experimental art spaces, because there's social preconceptions and formal theoretical distance doesn't really configure in a space that's heavily curated to be wild, like a dreamscape. And so the staged elements of the club are precisely what lead to the potential for performing spontaneity and birthing artistic genesis. If you look back at black and brown artists, I mean, not even from the past, but from today, or musicians, from techno to the blues to house to soul music, hip hop, they were following some really gut feelings, feelings that came only to them or from them or their particular environment. And they were often the music, it didn't depend on anything strictly intellectual, but it had this deeper intelligence that was unfiltered emotion and all its sort of beautiful strangeness. And like Howling Wolf will embrace his gravelly deep voice. DMX, I'm a child of the early 2000s, DMX, he'll bark, and Snoop is on this smooth level, and Lil Kim just wants to have sex, and Missy Elliott's a freak. I mean, she's a freak that we love. And Detroit techno focused on a very minimal kind of shamanic beat. It's a feeling, and it's a more raw and unprocessed and often a weird intuition that was idiosyncratic to the artist in that sense. And I think it's also why people like Lil Kim gets annoyed at young copycat female rappers, because she can see the lack of originality and the lack of soul, and so I think she's picking up on that. If you think of particularly two idiomatic white painters who says white people don't have culture, like Picasso. I know Hannah Gadsby thinks this is probo, but Picasso or Francis Bacon, what is so compelling about those painters, I think, is precisely that there's this obsession with the singularity that's only theirs. So Bacon will refer back to Velázquez, and Picasso will refer back to Delacroix, and so on, and even though they're fully conscious of their inheritors, they're not suffering from the anxiety of influence, because they've shuffled off those influences and made them their own, and because they have the courage or the audacity, like black and brown artists, if you like, to embrace what's completely unique in their unconscious. This is something that comes very naturally to Indigenous people, and sort of what's peculiar in your unconscious. So Francis Bacon, for example, became obsessed with dentist pictures of tooth decay. And I'm interested in this because I used to be a dental assistant before I was a DJ. Anyway, that's a whole other life. But also because I like it because it became a kind of creative spring for him that influenced particularly his early works all the way into his late works. And that wasn't an idea of something, that was a compulsion. A compulsion comes from a different place to an idea. I never had an idea to twerk or an idea to do a stanky face. Like, when you feel like it, you do a stanky face on the dance floor, like that. And it just spontaneously came from within me after seeing others do it. And my girlfriends and I, we follow this feeling, and it's really exuberant. It's like hitting the note kind of feeling. And it's a compulsion, and it's much more visceral. It's much darker, and it comes from a different source in ourselves. Not like from an idea like I'm gonna, I've got an idea for doing this, and I've got an idea for doing that, and, it's not that way. And if it is an idea, then it's more like the idea has us. Then we have the idea. It comes to us. It overtakes us, and it calls us, and then we have to submit to it. It's that way around. So rather than this notion of having ideas, which is a very common sort of 21st century notion and a very white notion. So we talk about having ideas as though we can consume them or produce them or appropriate them as though we own them. And in fact, whereas the best ideas, if ideas are valuable, are those that come like at us. They come from within without us anticipating them. Then the final example, and I'll stop on this one, is a similar sort of related notion of what I like to call perdition. So, perdition is a very old-fashioned word. It means literally being lost. And I think it marks out a similar kind of process. So that when we look for ideas, it's as if we're looking for navigation in the world, and we're looking for a kind of weather vane and, something to show us where to go. And it seems to me that that's exactly the opposite of what we should be doing if we want to be creative or produce new or original, exciting work. It's precisely the getting lost that seems to be the place in which we find our most innovative sources, if you like. So I'm always thinking here in relation to being Māori and being master oceanic voyagers. And we didn't always know where we were going, of course, but we thrived, and Māori are, even today, extremely adaptable and inventive, happy and resilient peoples. And I think we feel very connected to a self sort of navigating through an oceanic reality, and possibly, the unconscious and unconscious arts like music and good cinema, for example. So I'm also reminded of an essay by Walter Benjamin. He says that the only way to travel is to get lost. So he'd be completely despairing with modern day travel and Google Maps or Airbnb or pre-planning on the internet, and it makes you absolutely sure that you never ever get lost. It's a way of mastering a place without with a preordained program or itinerary, rather than exposing yourself to the culture you find yourself in. Really good exploration or a good adventure should be about not having the idea. It should be about being open to what's not formed as an idea in the first place, but it allows you to get lost in it. So the work I do and I see with artists, and this seems to come up again and again, there has to be a place of real stuckness, lostness, before you can come out again. Because unless you're truly lost, unless you truly feel resourceless, at some point in that process, you're not empty enough to receive. And if you keep yourself topped up with ideas all the time, and you're constantly watching TED Talks and going to ideas festivals and writers festivals, and you're constantly scrolling on your phone, and you'll never be open enough to get the sustenance that you require in order to move on. You'll end up just recycling what's already in the zeitgeist. So repeating things that are in the zeitgeist, like Netflix has shows that simply rehash and remix the 80s, and I think that's very indicative of our time. And there's a saying, white people have no culture again, so bringing that up again, I think there's a kernel of truth to that. I mean, they do often repeat what's already being done by black and brown people, and you see it with techno and house and hip-hop, and especially in the DJ world, they'll redo or proclaim cool what black and brown musicians did 20 years ago. White people, I think, are the victims of their own sort of intellectual, ideas-based tradition. Like the algorithms and the artificial intelligence they create, they lack a connection to an intuition, or they're unconscious, they're soulless, which becomes sort of the source of originality. And they reuse content constantly, with the exception of, say, someone like David Lynch, who values a meditative distance from thought, or Björk. She's excellent and she gets unconscious. So the idea of getting stuck or getting lost or not knowing the way forward and being radically uncertain, how we feel in these unprecedented times, seems to be an essential precondition for moving forward. So it seems to me Mother Nature has spoken, and we're sort of being forced into a more feminine and indigenous and intuitive age. But we get scared of it because we've inherited a sort of very masculine, rational European Anglo culture, and we want ideas, and ideas become our signal through the forest, as it were, on our way out. But Mother Nature has spoken. So like Māori, I think we got to go where the tide goes. So here are some ideas on ideas.